Welcome, my dear listener. Tonight, I shall tell you of an age when the world was young and the stars were closer to men as hearts. I have lived through many centuries, witnessed empires rise from dust and crumble back into silence. But few tales have haunted me as deeply as that of the Soviet Union, a dream born in blood, nurtured by iron will, and dissolved like morning mist after 70 years of storm and shadow. Tonight, I shall guide you through the entire span of that extraordinary experiment, from its violent birth in 1922 to its quiet death in 1991. We shall walk together through the corridors of the Kremlin, stand in the frozen trenches of Stalingrad, and feel the trembling hope of glasnost as it flickered in the darkness. This is not merely a chronicle of dates and decrees. It is a memory of human ambition, terror, triumph, and tragedy, all woven into the fabric of a single state that once held 1/6 of the Earth's surface in its grasp. Let us begin at the beginning, when the world was still reeling from the Great War, and a new vision of humanity was about to take shape in the coldest reaches of the old Russian Empire. I remember the winter of 1922 with peculiar clarity. The snow lay thick across the lands that had once belonged to the Romanovs, and the air smelled of wood smoke and something darker, the lingering scent of civil war. The Russian Empire, which had stood for 3 centuries under the rule of the Romanov dynasty, was no more. It had been a vast, sprawling dominion, covering nearly 1/6 of the Earth's land surface, home to Orthodox Russians, Catholic Poles, Protestant Finns, Muslim Azeris, and 100 smaller peoples whose names most Europeans could not even pronounce. In October of 1917, a man named Vladimir Lenin and his Bolsheviks had seized power in a moment of revolutionary They were the radical wing of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, and they promised the people peace, land, and bread. What they delivered first was war. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, signed with the Central Powers in March of 1918, ended Russia's involvement in the Great War, but it did not bring peace. Instead, it unleashed a civil war of staggering brutality, a war that would rage for years and claim millions of lives. I recall the stories told in whispered voices around village fires. On one side stood the Red Army, an army of soldiers with hardly any officers, driven by revolutionary zeal and the promise of a new world. On the other stood the White Army, an army of officers with hardly any soldiers, determined to restore the order that had existed before the Great War. Between them lay a country torn apart by famine, mutiny, and endless violence. There was a war with Poland in 1920, rebellions in the countryside, and mutinies even among those who had once supported the revolution. The Kronstadt sailors, who had been among the Bolsheviks' most loyal defenders, rose up against the new government in 1921, demanding freedom and bread. Foreign armies, Japanese, French, British, and American, intervened, hoping to crush the Bolshevik regime before it could take root. But their presence only strengthened the Red Army, for it allowed Lenin to claim that the revolution was under attack by foreign invaders. By the end of 1922, the Bolsheviks had finally succeeded in gaining control. The hard work of creating a new socialist country could now begin. Vladimir Lenin stood at the helm of the largest nation on earth, his will imposed upon a land exhausted by years of bloodshed. But Lenin was a practical man, and he understood that holding power required more than revolutionary fervor. It required organization, compromise, and above all, a solution to the problem of nationalities. The Russian Empire had been a multi-ethnic entity, containing Orthodox Russians, Catholic Poles, Protestant Finns, Georgians, with their ancient church, Muslim Chechens and Azeris, and countless smaller groups. How could the Bolsheviks keep these peoples within their new state while still honoring the revolutionary promise of self-determination? Lenin turned to one of his most trusted aides to solve this puzzle, a man named Joseph Jugashvili, better known by his party name, Stalin, which meant man of steel. Stalin was born in Georgia, the son of a shoemaker. He had attended a seminary in his youth, intending to become a priest, but he abandoned that path to join the Bolsheviks. He became known for his practical work, organizing bank robberies, smuggling weapons, arranging demonstrations, while other revolutionaries spent their time in European cafes debating theory. Stalin worked in the underground, building networks of loyalty and discipline. Lenin appointed Stalin as his nationalities expert in 1911, and Stalin traveled to Vienna to study the question. The solution they devised was elegant in theory. The Soviet Union would be socialist in content, nationalist in form. Each nationality would have its own homeland, its own republic, but all would be bound together in a federal union governed by the Communist Party. In December of 1922, the Bolsheviks enacted the creation of a federal system of republics known as the USSR, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. The name itself was a statement of principle. It was Soviet because the political form was based on elected councils. The Russian word for council is Soviet. It was socialist because the state owned the means of production. The founding republics were 4 in number. The Russian Federal Republic, which still contained most of the old empire's territory, the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, the Belarusian Soviet Socialist Republic, and the Transcaucasian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, which later split into Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. The first constitution of the USSR was ratified in January of 19. It established a highly centralized state, while nominally preserving the right of free secession for each republic. This was a clever fiction. No republic would ever be allowed to leave, but even as this new state took shape, its architect was fading. Lenin had been struck by a series of strokes that rendered him unable to speak. He grew increasingly concerned about the future, particularly about the man he had trusted to solve the nationalities question. Lenin had come to fear that Stalin would develop a cult of personality, that he would concentrate too much power in his own hands. But Lenin's warnings came too late. In January of 1924, Vladimir Lenin died, and the struggle for succession began in earnest. Stalin was a patient man. While others postured and debated, he worked quietly, building networks of loyalty within the party apparatus. His greatest rival was Leon Trotsky, the brilliant orator who had led the Red Army to victory in the Civil War. But Trotsky was arrogant. He believed that his fame and his revolutionary credentials would carry him to power without the need for tiresome organizational work. This was his fatal mistake. Stalin controlled the party machinery. He determined who received invitations to meetings, who spoke, and in what order, who was appointed to key positions. As General Secretary of the Central Committee, he held what seemed like a boring administrative post, but in a system where the party controlled everything, the man who controlled the party controlled the country. Stalin moved systematically against his rivals. He told Trotsky to take a rest, suggested he travel to the Caucasus for his health. Trotsky, who suffered from nervous ailments, agreed. While Trotsky was away, Stalin arranged Lenin's funeral. taking complete control of the ceremonies and the narrative of Lenin's legacy. Trotsky missed the funeral. In the distribution of power that followed, he found himself outmaneuvered at every turn. Stalin then formed an alliance with two other Bolshevik leaders, Grigory Zinoviev and Lev Kamenev, to force Trotsky into exile. Once that was accomplished, Stalin turned on his allies. By the late 1920s, Stalin had consolidated near-absolute power. His vision for the Soviet Union was radically different from Lenin's cautious new economic policy. Lenin had allowed market forces and private enterprise to operate in small businesses and agriculture, believing that the country needed time to recover from the devastation of civil war. This policy had stabilized the food supply and brought a measure of prosperity. But Stalin rejected this compromise. He believed that the only way to ensure the survival of the USSR and transform it into a great power was through rapid, centralized economic change. He would pursue this goal at any cost. In 1928, Stalin launched the first of three successive five-year plans, focused heavily on productive capacity, especially heavy industry and power output. He looked to America, the rising industrial giant, and sought to emulate its mass production miracles. "We are 50 or 100 years behind the advanced countries," Stalin declared. "We must make up this gap in 10 years. Either we do it, or they will crush us." Russia's industrial capacity rose nearly 300% between 1928 and 1941. Entire cities were built from nothing to house new factories. Hydroelectric dams rose across the landscape. The Soviet Union was transforming itself through sheer force of will. But this transformation came at a terrible price. I remember the early 1930s with a sorrow that has never entirely left me. It was a time when the earth itself seemed to turn against humanity, when the fields that had fed millions for centuries suddenly yielded nothing but dust and death. Stalin's industrialization required resources, machines, technology, foreign expertise. To pay for these, the Soviet Union needed to export grain. But the peasants who grew that grain were not producing enough, and they were not willing to surrender their harvests to the state. Stalin's solution was forced collectivization. Beginning in late 1929, he enacted a policy to liquidate the wealthy farming class, the kulaks, and force smaller peasants onto state-run collective farms. The violence was immediate and widespread. Red Army soldiers descended on villages, seizing grain, livestock, and land. Those who resisted were shot or deported to labor camps in Siberia. Even those who complied often found themselves branded as kulaks and subjected to the same treatment. For the first time in Russian history, peasants ate all the meat they wanted because they slaughtered their animals rather than hand them over to the collectives. Great feasts were held in desperate defiance, consuming in days what would have sustained families for months. But when the feasts ended, the famine began. The collective farms were poorly organized, inefficiently managed, and lacked proper equipment. The quotas imposed by Moscow were impossibly high. Even when there was no seed left to plant for the next year's harvest, the state demanded its grain. The famine that followed was one of the greatest tragedies in human history. It struck hardest in Ukraine, the breadbasket of the empire, but it spread across the entire USSR. Estimates vary, but approximately 12 million people died of starvation between 1930 and 1933. I recall hearing stories of villages where every house stood empty, where children with swollen bellies wandered the roads searching for anything edible. grass, bark, even earth itself was consumed in the desperate hope of survival. The Soviet government denied that any famine existed. They censored reports, arrested those who spoke of it, and continued to export grain even as their own people starved. When the census of 1937 revealed that 12 million people were missing from the population, Stalin had the census takers shot and ordered a new census with falsified numbers. This was the cost of industrialization. This was the price of Stalin's dream of a great power. The peasantry, as a political force, had been destroyed, cowed into submission by terror and hunger. But the scars left upon the land and the people would never fully heal. If the famine broke the peasantry, the Great Terror broke everyone else. Terror had been a feature of the Bolshevik system from its inception. Lenin had created the Cheka, the secret police, in 1917, shortly after seizing power. But Stalin expanded this machinery vastly, transforming it into an instrument of absolute control. In the mid-1930s, Stalin launched what came to be known as the Great Terror, a period of deliberate bloodshed and mass murder that targeted not foreign enemies or class opponents, but the Communist Party itself. Old Bolshevik comrades, men who had fought alongside Lenin in the Revolution and the Civil War, were arrested on trumped-up charges of treason, espionage, and sabotage. Show trials were held in Moscow, carefully rehearsed spectacles designed to demonstrate Stalin's vigilance against enemies within. Zinoviev and Kamenev, who had helped Stalin defeat Trotsky, were among the first to fall. They were forced to confess to absurd crimes, conspiring with foreign powers, plotting to assassinate Stalin, working for fascist intelligence services. Then they were executed. Over 1 million people, most of them innocent, were executed during the Great Terror. Millions more were sent to the Gulag, the vast system of forced labor camps that stretched across Siberia and the Far East. The Gulag was a world unto itself, a frozen hell where political prisoners, petty criminals, and anyone deemed hostile to the regime were worked to death in mines, logging camps, and construction sites. The conditions were unspeakable. Prisoners lived in crude barracks, poorly clothed, and fed starvation rations, forced to labor in temperatures that could drop to 50 degrees below zero. Perhaps 2 million people died in the camps during Stalin's rule, though exact numbers will never be known. The camps were deliberately placed in the most remote and inhospitable regions, far from prying eyes. The logic of the terror was paradoxical. Stalin believed that the faster the Soviet Union advanced toward socialism, the more desperate its enemies would become, and therefore the more vigilant the state must be. Every success justified greater repression. No one was safe. Communist Party officials, military officers, factory managers, intellectuals, artists, all lived in constant fear of denunciation and arrest. A careless word, a failure to applaud enthusiastically at a meeting, even friendship with someone who had fallen under suspicion could mean death or the Gulag. The army was devastated. Thousands of officers, including most of the high command, were arrested and executed on charges of conspiring with foreign powers. By 1938, the Red Army had been decapitated, its leadership destroyed, just as the threat of war loomed larger on the horizon. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the terror slowed. By late 1938, even Stalin seemed to recognize that it could not continue indefinitely. Nikolai Yezhov, the head of the secret police who had orchestrated much of the bloodshed, was himself arrested and executed. The machinery of terror did not stop, but it shifted to a lower gear. By the end of the 1930s, Stalin was the absolute master of the Soviet Union. Every potential rival had been eliminated. Every institution had been purged and rebuilt in his image. The cult of personality that Lenin had feared now dominated every aspect of Soviet life. Stalin's portrait hung in every office, every school, every home. But even as Stalin consolidated his power internally, the world outside was moving toward a catastrophe that would test the Soviet Union as never before. I have witnessed many acts of diplomatic cynicism in my long life, but few shocked the world as profoundly as the pact signed in Moscow on the 23rd of August, 1939. Hitler and Stalin, the fascist dictator and the communist leader, ideological enemies who had denounced each other for years, suddenly became allies. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, named after the foreign ministers who signed it, was officially a non-aggression treaty. But it contained a secret protocol that divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. Poland would be carved up between Germany and the Soviet Union. The three Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, would fall under Soviet control, as would Bessarabia and northern Bukovina territories, then belonging to Romania. Stalin had his reasons. He feared that the Western democracies, Britain and France, were trying to manipulate Germany and the Soviet Union into destroying each other while they stood aside. At the Munich Conference in 1938, Britain and France had appeased Hitler by allowing him to seize part of Czechoslovakia, and Stalin had not been invited to participate. Stalin concluded that he could not trust the West to honor any alliance. Better to make a deal with Hitler, gain time to prepare for the inevitable conflict, and seize territory that would provide a buffer against German invasion. The pact gave Stalin what he wanted. When Germany invaded Poland on the 1st of September 1939, starting the Second World War, Soviet forces moved into eastern Poland 2 weeks later. The two armies met in the middle, shook hands, and divided the spoils. Over the next 2 years, the Soviet Union annexed the Baltic states, seized territory from Romania, and fought a brutal winter war with Finland to push the border away from Leningrad. Everywhere the Red Army went, the Soviet system followed mass arrests, deportations, executions. Hundreds of thousands of people were sent to labor camps or simply murdered. In the Katyn forest, Soviet secret police executed 22,000 Polish officers, intellectuals, and community leaders, burying them in mass graves that would not be discovered until years later. But Stalin's bargain with Hitler bought him less time than he hoped. And when the reckoning came, it came with a fury that nearly destroyed the Soviet Union entirely. Dawn came early on the 22nd of June, 1941. The birds were singing in the forests along the Soviet frontier when the earth suddenly erupted in fire. Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's massive invasion of the Soviet Union, began with a bombardment of unimaginable scale. 3 million German soldiers, supported by thousands of tanks, aircraft, and artillery pieces, smashed across the border, on a front stretching 1,600 miles from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Stalin had been warned. His spies in Germany, some of the best intelligence operatives in the world, had sent repeated warnings that an invasion was imminent. They had even provided the exact date. Churchill himself had sent intelligence confirming that Hitler planned to attack. Stalin refused to believe it. He convinced himself that Hitler would not be foolish enough to fight on 2 fronts, while Britain remained undefeated. He believed the warnings were British provocations designed to trick him into a premature conflict with Germany. The result was catastrophe. The Red Army was caught completely unprepared. Entire divisions were destroyed in the first hours of the invasion. Thousands of aircraft were destroyed on the ground before they could even take off. Within weeks, the Germans had advanced hundreds of miles, encircling and capturing entire Soviet armies. Stalin was stunned. For several days, he retreated to his dacha, apparently paralyzed by shock and disbelief. "Lenin left us a state," he lamented, "and we've screwed it up." His inner circle found him there and convinced him to return to Moscow and take control. When he finally addressed the Soviet people by radio, he called the conflict the Great Patriotic War, framing it not as a defense of communism, but as a defense of the motherland against foreign invaders. This proved to be a stroke of genius. Millions of Soviet citizens who had suffered under Stalin's terror, who had lost family members in the purges and the famine, rallied to defend their country. They fought not for Stalin or for communism, but for Russia itself, for their homes and families. But the fighting was brutal beyond measure. The Germans laid siege to Leningrad for nearly 900 days, starving the city's population. More than 1 million people died there, many from hunger and cold. At Moscow, the invaders came within sight of the Kremlin spires before they were finally stopped by the onset of winter and the desperate resistance of the Red Army. Stalin ordered that Moscow must be held at all costs, and it was. The industrial evacuation was one of the war's greatest logistical miracles. As the Germans advanced, entire factories were dismantled, loaded onto trains, and moved east beyond the Ural Mountains. Within months, these factories were reassembled and producing tanks, aircraft, and ammunition again. The Soviet Union became one of the big three Allied powers, receiving massive shipments of supplies from the United States and Britain through the Lend-Lease program. But the bulk of the fighting in Europe was done by the Red Army, which faced the majority of Germany's military forces. The turning point came at Stalingrad in 1942 and 1943. The city on the Volga became the site of the most savage urban combat in history. For months, the two armies fought street by street, house by house, sometimes room by room. The Soviets eventually encircled and destroyed an entire German army there, capturing more than 90,000 prisoners. From that point forward, the Red Army advanced westward, liberating Soviet territory and then driving into Eastern Europe. The cost was staggering. Approximately 27 million Soviet citizens died during the war. A whole generation of young men lost, along with devastating economic destruction. But the Soviet Union survived. And when the war ended in May of 1945, with the capture of Berlin, Stalin emerged as one of the most powerful leaders in the world. The victory celebrations in Moscow were grand, but the world that emerged from the war was profoundly changed. Two superpowers now dominated the globe, the United States and the Soviet Union, and their alliance of convenience quickly crumbled into mutual suspicion and hostility. At the Yalta Conference in February of 1945, and later at Potsdam in July, the leaders of the Big Three met to determine the post-war order. Germany was divided into occupation zones. Stalin was granted influence over Eastern Europe, where the Red Army already stood as an occupying force. Stalin had a saying, "Whoever occupies a territory also imposes his own social system upon it." And so it came to pass. Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, Romania, and East Germany all became Soviet satellites, their governments controlled by communist parties loyal to Moscow. Winston Churchill, who had fought alongside Stalin during the war, now saw the danger clearly. In March of 1946, speaking in Fulton, Missouri, he declared, "From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent." The Cold War had begun. For Stalin, the Cold War served multiple purposes. Externally, it justified the maintenance of a massive military and the Soviet Union's control over Eastern Europe. Internally, it provided a rationale for continued repression and isolation from the West. The immediate post-war years were, in many ways, darker than the 1930s. A new wave of purges swept through the party: the Leningrad case, the doctor's plot, and countless others. Returning prisoners of war were treated as traitors and sent to the Gulag. Anyone who had been exposed to life in the West was suspect. Russian nationalism was promoted to an almost absurd degree. Every significant invention or discovery was suddenly claimed to have been made by a Russian first. An anti-cosmopolitan campaign targeted anyone with foreign connections or who expressed admiration for Western culture. But the Soviet Union was also becoming a true superpower. In 1949, the USSR successfully tested its first atomic bomb, breaking the American monopoly on nuclear weapons. In 1953, it tested a hydrogen bomb. The Korean War, which began in 1950, became the first major proxy conflict of the Cold War. The Soviet Union supplied weapons and advisors to North Korea and China, while the United States fought alongside South Korea. The war ended in stalemate in 1953, but it set the pattern for decades of indirect conflict between the superpowers. And then, in March of 1953, Joseph Stalin died. The scramble for power that followed was immediate and chaotic. A troika of leaders, Georgy Malenkov, Lavrentiy Beria, and Vyacheslav Molotov, initially shared control. Beria, ironically, pushed for far-reaching reforms, but he was arrested and executed within months. Eventually, a new leader emerged from the competition: Nikita Khrushchev, a coarse, semi-literate party boss whom everyone had underestimated. Stalin himself had kept Khrushchev around because he seemed too much a clown to pose any threat. But Khrushchev was shrewder than he appeared, and he was about to shake the communist world to its foundations. I remember the 20th Party Congress in February of 1956 as one of those rare moments when history pivots on a single speech. Nikita Khrushchev stood before the assembled delegates in a closed session and delivered what came to be known as the secret speech. For 4 hours, he denounced Stalin, revealing the cult of personality that had formed around the dictator: the purges, the false confessions, the torture, the executions. The speech was not supposed to become public, but word spread rapidly. Copies were smuggled out and circulated. Around the world, communists reeled in shock. Many had believed in Stalin with religious fervor. Now they learned that their idol had been a monster. This revelation initiated what came to be called the Thaw, a period of subtle changes to everyday life in the Soviet Union. Fear lessened. Cultural expression became somewhat freer. Some victims of the purges were rehabilitated and allowed to return from the camps. Khrushchev also embarked on ambitious domestic reforms. He attempted to decentralize economic decision-making, giving more power to the regions. He launched campaigns to improve agriculture, including a disastrous plan to cultivate corn across the Soviet Union in imitation of American farming methods. But Khrushchev's greatest achievements were in science and technology. The Soviet Union poured resources into the space program, and the results were spectacular. On the 4th of October, 1957, the USSR launched Sputnik, the first artificial satellite to orbit the Earth. The little sphere, sending its radio beeps back to the planet, caused panic in the West. If the Soviets could put a satellite into space, they could surely deliver a nuclear warhead to any city on Earth. Then, on the 12th of April, 1961, the Soviet Union achieved an even more stunning triumph. Yuri Gagarin became the first human being in space. His single orbit of the Earth and safe return made him an instant international hero. These achievements led many in the world to view the USSR as a genuine comparable competitor with the United States. Some even predicted that the Soviet system might eventually surpass the capitalist West in prosperity and technological achievement. But Khrushchev's foreign policy was reckless and unpredictable. The shooting down of an American U-2 spy plane over Soviet territory in 1960 led to the collapse of a planned summit with President Eisenhower. Relations with China deteriorated into the Sino-Soviet split, partly triggered by Khrushchev's denunciation of Stalin, whom Mao Zedong still admired. And then came the Cuban Missile Crisis in October of 1962. The crisis began when the United States placed nuclear missiles in Turkey, near the Soviet border. In response, Khrushchev secretly shipped nuclear missiles to Cuba, where Fidel Castro had recently established a communist government just 90 miles from Florida. When American spy planes discovered the missiles, President Kennedy demanded their removal and imposed a naval blockade on Cuba. For 13 days, the world teetered on the brink of nuclear war. I remember those days with particular clarity. Ordinary people around the globe went about their daily lives, wondering if each day might be their last, if the missiles would fly and the cities would burn. In the end, cooler heads prevailed. Khrushchev agreed to remove the missiles from Cuba in exchange for an American promise not to invade the island and a secret agreement to remove American missiles from Turkey. Soviet newspapers proclaimed that the USSR had saved the world through its wise diplomacy. But within the Kremlin, many saw the crisis as a humiliating retreat. Combined with Khrushchev's agricultural failures and his erratic behavior, it sealed his fate. In October of 1964, while Khrushchev was on vacation at the Black Sea, his colleagues in the Politburo organized a plot against him. He was summoned back to Moscow and forced to resign, officially for reasons of health. The era of Nikita Khrushchev was over. The era of Leonid Brezhnev was about to begin. Leonid Brezhnev was, in many ways, the opposite of Khrushchev. Where Khrushchev had been impulsive and reformist, Brezhnev was cautious and conservative. Where Khrushchev had denounced Stalin, Brezhnev quietly rehabilitated much of Stalin's legacy. Brezhnev reversed Khrushchev's attempts at decentralization, bringing all power back to Moscow and to the center. He stopped the process of deionization, and political life in the Soviet Union settled into a comfortable routine for the party elite. The Brezhnev era would later be called the era of stagnation, and the term was apt. Politically, the Soviet Union became increasingly ossified. The same elderly men occupied the top positions year after year, decade after decade, ruling through inertia and patronage networks. Culturally, the thaw gave way to a new freeze. Dissidents like Alexander Solzhenitsyn and Andrei Sakharov were harassed, arrested, or exiled. Writers practiced self-censorship to avoid trouble. The excitement and hope of the Khrushchev years faded into cynical resignation. Yet, paradoxically, these were also years of relative prosperity for ordinary Soviet citizens. The early 1970s saw a significant increase in consumer goods. People could buy televisions, refrigerators, and other amenities that had been scarce or unavailable before. A genuine Soviet consumer culture began to emerge. Internationally, Brezhnev achieved much of what Stalin had dreamed of: true superpower status. The Soviet Union reached parity with the United States in nuclear weapons. Soviet influence extended into Africa, Latin America, and Asia. The USSR seemed to be on an equal footing with America. A period of détente, or relaxation of tensions, characterized the early 1970s. Brezhnev met with President Nixon, and the two countries signed arms control agreements, most notably the SALT I Treaty, limiting strategic nuclear weapons. But beneath the surface, the Soviet economy was beginning to crack. The methods that had worked in the 1930s, central planning, heavy industry, mobilization of resources, were proving inadequate for a modern, complex economy. Economic growth slowed. The technological gap with the West widened. Agriculture remained chronically inefficient, requiring costly food imports. The Soviet Union became increasingly dependent on exports of oil and natural gas to earn hard currency. When Brezhnev ordered the invasion of Afghanistan in December of 1979, ostensibly to prop up a friendly communist government, he made one of the Soviet Union's worst strategic mistakes. The Afghan War became the Soviet Union's Vietnam, a grinding, unwinnable conflict that drained resources and morale. Over 14,000 Soviet soldiers died there. Many more returned home, wounded or psychologically scarred. The war was deeply unpopular at home, and it severely damaged the Soviet Union's international reputation. Détente collapsed. The United States, under President Reagan, embarked on a massive military buildup designed to pressure the Soviet economy beyond its limits. The arms race escalated to levels not seen since the 1960s, and then Brezhnev's health began to fail. By the early 1980s, he was clearly dying, barely able to deliver speeches, propped up by aides. But he clung to power until his death in November of 1982. His successors were no better. Yuri Andropov, the former KGB chief, took over, but was already too ill to implement the reforms the country desperately needed. He died in February of 1984, after only 15 months in office. Konstantin Chernenko, even older and more infirm, succeeded him. The joke went that Brezhnev had run on batteries, but Chernenko had transistors. He died in March of 1985, after just 13 months. 3 leaders dead in 3 years. The Soviet Union's leadership was literally dying off, a perfect symbol of the system's exhaustion and decay. And then came the young man, the reformer, the last hope, Mikhail Gorbachev. Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in March of 1985 with a mandate for change. At 54, he was young by Soviet standards. Indeed, he was the first Soviet leader born after the revolution itself. Gorbachev understood that the Soviet economy was in crisis. Growth had stalled. Technology lagged decades behind the West. The Afghan War was an open wound. The arms race with the United States was bankrupting the country. His solution was twofold: perestroika and glasnost. Perestroika, meaning restructuring, aimed to introduce elements of market economics into the planned economy. Gorbachev believed that by allowing some private enterprise and decentralizing economic decision-making, he could revitalize the moribund Soviet system. Glasnost, meaning openness, aimed to introduce transparency and free discussion of problems. Gorbachev believed that corruption and inefficiency thrived in secrecy, and that exposing these problems to public scrutiny would help solve them. Both policies had profound and unintended consequences. The first major test came on the 26th of April, 1986, when the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in Ukraine exploded, releasing massive amounts of radioactive contamination into the atmosphere. The initial instinct of Soviet authorities was to cover up the disaster, to deny and minimize, but the radioactive cloud spread across Europe, and Western countries detected it immediately. The old habits of secrecy could not hold. Eventually, Gorbachev used Chernobyl as proof that the old system had to change, that glasnost was essential. The disaster became a symbol of the Soviet system's failures, its corner-cutting, its incompetence, its disregard for human life. Glasnost opened the floodgates. Newspapers began publishing exposes of corruption, inefficiency, and past crimes. The purges, the famine, the gulag, all the horrors of the Stalin era that had been whispered about privately could now be discussed openly. This revelation was cathartic, but also destabilizing. If the party had lied about Stalin, what else had it lied about? If the system had committed such monstrous crimes, why should it be trusted to rule now? Gorbachev also moved aggressively to end the Cold War. He met with President Reagan and later President Bush, negotiating dramatic reductions in nuclear weapons. He announced that Soviet forces would withdraw from Afghanistan, which they did in February of 1989. Most dramatically, Gorbachev refused to intervene when communist governments in Eastern Europe began to collapse in 1989. He announced what came to be called the Sinatra Doctrine. The countries of Eastern Europe could do it their way. This was a clear repudiation of the Brezhnev Doctrine, which had justified the invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1960. One by one, the satellite states fell. Poland held free elections in June. Hungary opened its borders in September. The Berlin Wall, that most potent symbol of the Cold War, was breached on the 9th of November, 1989, as jubilant crowds tore it down with their bare hands. By the end of the year, communist governments had fallen in Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, and Romania. The Soviet Empire in Eastern Europe had dissolved without a shot being fired. Gorbachev won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1994, his role in ending the Cold War. In the West, he was hailed as a hero, a visionary who had chosen peace and freedom over empire and ideology. But at home, the situation was rapidly spiraling out of control. Perestroika had failed to revitalize the economy. Instead, the timid reforms created confusion and shortages. The old system of central planning was breaking down, but no functioning market economy had emerged to replace it. Store shelves grew emptier, inflation accelerated, a criminal black market flourished. People waited in endless lines for basic necessities. The standard of living, which had been slowly improving under Brezhnev, now declined sharply. The Communist Party, which had ruled through fear and ideology, lost all authority. If the party had lied about the past, if it had no solutions for the present, why should anyone obey it? Even more dangerous was the rise of nationalist and separatist movements throughout the Soviet Union. Glasnost had opened the door not just to criticism of the party, but to questioning the very structure of the Soviet state. The desire to leave the Union was strongest in the Baltic republics Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. These countries had been independent between the two world wars, and they had been forcibly incorporated into the USSR in 1940 under the secret protocol of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Now, emboldened by glasnost and inspired by the revolutions in Eastern Europe, they pushed for independence. Lithuania declared independence in March of 1990, a bold unilateral move that sent shockwaves through Moscow. Gorbachev tried to hold the Union together through a combination of persuasion, economic pressure, and limited force. Soviet troops occupied government buildings in Vilnius, Lithuania, in January of 1991, killing 14 civilians. But the crackdown only hardened Lithuanian resolve and damaged Gorbachev's reputation as a reformer. Meanwhile, a new political force was emerging to challenge Gorbachev: Boris Yeltsin, the president of the Russian Republic itself. Yeltsin was a complicated figure. He had been a Gorbachev ally in the early years of perestroika, but the two men had fallen out. Yeltsin was more radical, more willing to embrace market economics and Russian nationalism. He used his position as leader of the Russian Republic as a power base to challenge Gorbachev's authority over the Soviet Union as a whole. The confrontation between Gorbachev and Yeltsin grew increasingly sharp. Gorbachev wanted to preserve the Soviet Union, albeit in a reformed and more democratic shape. Yeltsin seemed willing to let the Union dissolve if that would advance Russian interests and his own political fortunes. In the summer of 1991, Gorbachev negotiated a new Union treaty that would have transformed the USSR into a looser confederation of sovereign republics. It was scheduled to be signed on the 20th of August, but conservative forces within the government decided they could not allow this to happen. They believed that the new Union Treaty would be the death of the Soviet Union, and they moved to prevent it. On the morning of the 19th of August, 1991, tanks rolled into Moscow. A group of 8 high-ranking officials, including the vice president, the prime minister, the defense minister, and the head of the KGB, announced that Gorbachev had been removed from power due to illness. They called themselves the State Committee on the State of Emergency, and they declared a state of emergency throughout the Soviet Union. They announced that the reforms had gone too far, that order must be restored, but the coup plotters were inept. They failed to arrest Yeltsin, who barricaded himself in the Russian Parliament building, the White House. They failed to secure control of communications. They failed to articulate a clear vision of what they wanted to achieve. Yeltsin emerged as the hero of the hour. On the afternoon of the 19th of August, he climbed atop one of the tanks surrounding the White House and addressed a crowd of supporters. He denounced the coup as illegal and called on the army and the people to resist. The image of Yeltsin standing on that tank, defying the coup plotters, became one of the defining moments of the end of the Soviet Union. For 3 days, the confrontation continued. Crowds gathered around the White House to defend it. Some military units refused to obey orders to attack. The coup plotters wavered, unable to commit to the bloodshed that would have been necessary to succeed. On the 21st of August, the coup collapsed. The plotters fled or were arrested. Gorbachev was freed from house arrest at his vacation home in Crimea and returned to Moscow. But Gorbachev's authority had been fatally undermined. During the coup, it had been Yeltsin, not Gorbachev, who had rallied the resistance. It was now clear to everyone that real power lay with Yeltsin and the Russian Republic, not with Gorbachev and the Soviet Union. Yeltsin moved swiftly to consolidate his position. He banned the Communist Party in the Russian Republic. He took control of Soviet government ministries, absorbing their functions into the Russian government. One by one, the republics declared independence. Ukraine, the second largest republic, held a referendum in December and voted overwhelmingly for independence. Without Ukraine, there could be no Soviet Union. The country was too important economically and politically. Gorbachev tried desperately to save the Union, but events had moved beyond his control. The Soviet Union was dissolving not through formal legal processes, but through simple, practical reality. The republics were acting as independent states, and there was no force capable of stopping them. On the 8th of December, 1991, the leaders of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus met at a hunting lodge in the Belovezskaya forest near the Polish border. Over vodka and long discussions, they agreed to formally dissolve the USSR and establish the Commonwealth of Independent States in its place. Gorbachev learned of this decision from a phone call. He was president of a country that had just been voted out of existence by 3 men in a forest. The last weeks of the Soviet Union had a strange, dreamlike quality. The state continued to function in a kind of bureaucratic autopilot, even as everyone knew it was finished. Gorbachev gave speeches calling for the preservation of the Union, but no one listened anymore. His office still existed. His staff still came to work, but his actual power had evaporated. On the 25th of December 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev went on television to announce his resignation as president of the Soviet Union. It was a short speech, dignified and sad. "I hereby discontinue my activities at the post of President of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics," he said. He spoke of his regrets, his hopes that the reforms would continue, his belief that the end of the Cold War had been worth the price. When the speech ended, the Soviet flag was lowered from the Kremlin for the last time. In its place rose the white, blue, and red tricolor of Russia. The following day, the 26th of December, the Supreme Soviet held its final session. In a brief, procedural vote, it formally dissolved the Soviet Union. The USSR officially ceased to exist on the 31st of December, 1991. It broke apart into its 15 constituent republics: Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, the 3 Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, the 3 Caucasian republics of Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan, and the 5 Central Asian republics of Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzstan, plus Moldova. The Central Asian republics, in truth, had not wanted independence. They had hesitated, uncertain about their ability to survive economically without the Union. But they had no choice. The Union was gone, and they had to make their own way. Russia, under Boris Yeltsin, took over the Soviet Union's seat on the United Nations Security Council, its embassies around the world, and its nuclear arsenal. In effect, Russia became the successor state to the USSR, though much diminished in size and power. The collapse happened with remarkable speed and surprising peacefulness. There were local conflicts, particularly in the Caucasus, but there was no great civil war, no desperate last stand by Soviet loyalists. The system simply ran out of legitimacy and authority, and it collapsed like a house built on sand. And now I must ask you, dear listener, to pause with me and consider what this all meant, what it means still. The Soviet Union lasted 70 years. In the span of human history, that is barely a moment. Yet within that moment, it shaped the entire 20th century. It survived a civil war, defeated Nazi Germany, reached for the stars, and then dissolved into memory. I have lived long enough to see many empires rise and fall, but few left such a complicated legacy. The Soviet Union gave the world great achievements: the defeat of Hitler, the first man in space, extraordinary advances in science and mathematics and literature. It proved that a planned economy could industrialize a backward country, though at terrible human cost. But it also gave the world horrors that still haunt us, the famine that killed millions, the gulag that swallowed countless innocents, the terror that made fear a constant companion, the totalitarian control that crushed the human spirit. Was it all inevitable? Could a different leader, at a different moment, have guided the revolution toward a more humane outcome? Or was there something in the Leninist system itself, in the idea of a revolutionary vanguard ruling in the name of the people, that made tyranny unavoidable? I cannot answer these questions with certainty. I can only tell you what I witnessed, what I remember. I remember the hope of 1917, when ordinary people believed that a new world was being born. I remember the courage of 1941, when millions fought and died to defend their homeland. I remember the joy of 1961, when Gagarin's smile seemed to promise that the future would be bright. And I remember the quiet resignation of 1991, when people watched the Soviet flag come down and wondered what would come next. The Soviet Union was, in the end, a human creation, flawed, contradictory, capable of both greatness and horror. It was built by people who believed they could remake the world according to reason, who thought that human nature itself could be transformed through the right social and economic structures. They were wrong about that. Human nature cannot be remade by decree, but their attempt to do so shaped the lives of hundreds of millions of people and altered the course of history. Some called the collapse of the Soviet Union the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. Others saw it as a liberation, the long overdue death of a tyrannical system. Both views contain truth. What remains is memory, memory of what was tried, what succeeded, what failed, and what was lost. The Soviet Union is gone, but its shadow still falls across the lands where it once ruled. The institutions it built, the habits of mind it created, the traumas it inflicted, all these persist. And perhaps that is the most important lesson. History is not simply a series of dates and events to be memorized. It is a living presence, shaping us in ways we often do not recognize. The past is never truly past. It echoes in the present, in the choices we make and the futures we imagine. The Soviet Union was an attempt to escape from history, to begin the world anew. It failed, as all such attempts must fail. We cannot escape our history. We can only try to understand it, to learn from it, and to build something better on the ruins of what came before. And thus ends another memory from ages long past. If you have found a spark of wonder here, stay a while longer, for there are countless tales yet to be remembered.